Herewith, a tale of two leaders and an unselfconscious pat on the back for AIDS-free world. I was in New York all week. As you know, the General Assembly of the United Nations opened, and it began with that brazen, bombastic performance of Donald Trump on Tuesday morning. It's so fascinating when you talk and chat in the corridors of the UN and the adjacent agencies what people think of Donald Trump and their reaction. In fact, there are three broad reactions. First, incredulity. How can the most important political figure in the world take the podium of the United Nations and say that he's prepared to obliterate an entire country and its people? Secondly, the reaction that says, well, he's a dunce, he's a schoolyard bully, forget it, don't pay any attention. And third, a kind of roiling subterranean undercurrent of dread and fear about what might happen. In fact, interestingly enough, more fear about a possible military escapade out of the White House than there is fear about North Korea. All right, let me have a patriotic spasm for the moment and talk about the Prime Minister of Canada who took the podium, Justin Trudeau, and made a very, very unusual speech. He dealt with Aboriginal issues with Indigenous peoples, and he very openly said, when have you ever heard this from the podium of the United Nations, that Canada was, quote, a work in progress, close quote. He explained rather fully that the relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples, Indigenous nations, certainly over the 150 years of Canadian nationhood, had been one of oppression and humiliation. He even went so far as to say that there were many reserves in Canada where there was no drinking water, and where parents got up in the morning wondering whether their children or child had committed suicide during the course of the night. It was a pretty self-indicting, self-lacerating speech. But of course he said that there would be a major transformation, and now everything would change in the relationships between the government and Indigenous nations across Canada. I smiled slightly. I thought to myself, I've just returned recently from a trip to the Arctic, the high Arctic in northern Canada, in the territory of Nunavut, where the Inuit people live, the majority of the Inuit people live. And I was there to look at an epidemic of tuberculosis amongst children, in particular in many of the communities. And that's an epidemic that can be cured. That's an epidemic that can be taken control of if only the government of Canada will intervene with the resources and the training and the cultural support and particularly language support which is required. So obviously we're going to put great pressure on the Prime Minister now to deliver on the promises that were made at the UN podium, as so many Indigenous peoples will now do. And finally, I wanted to make the point that the week didn't start with Tuesday. The week, as most weeks do, started on Monday. And in the afternoon, there were two unprecedented sessions dealing with sexual exploitation and abuse committed by UN peacekeepers in UN peacekeeping operations, but extended to the entire UN family, all of the UN agencies. And the first session was dominated by the presence of the Secretary General, Guterres, and many leading figures internationally. And then the second session was with civil society, but a lot of senior UN personnel as well. What emerged from the two sessions was that the United Nations still has no idea how to deal effectively with sexual abuse in any of its operations across the UN system. And they're not prepared to accept the dramatic change that is required and that we're advancing. But what became clear in the process was that none of it would have happened had it not been for the determined advocacy of AIDS-Free World's Code Blue campaign. Many people said so. And it demonstrates, I think, that even a small group of people with tenacious and indefatigable advocacy can bring even an organization like the United Nations to heel. That was last week. I'm Stephen Lewis.